If you want to forward locate nuclear weapons on Poland's soil, then I'm happy to do that.
From the President of Poland's point of view, this is yet another opportunity to flex his muscles.
You're old enough to remember this. I'm not. Point
Well,
made.
thank you. We're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile
Crisis.
I knew.
Russia is targeting cities, it's targeting energy infrastructure, it's targeting the front line. And Russia overmatched Ukraine by 10 to 1.
The railway and the roads that you've blown up, the bridges you've destroyed, you now need to rely upon. It is a thing of absolute beauty, what they've done. The question is, it's beauty on one side, it's the beast on the other.
18-year-old on the battlefield who watches his drone get shot down, reprograms it overnight.
Yeah.
So changes it from a GPS drone to a terrain matching drone so that it can get through the next day. And welcome everybody, episode 26 of the Red Matrix podcast. Big issue today. The major issue is this talk about nuclear weapons being forward deployed to Poland, escalates the whole risk of potentially nuclear war. Really worrying development. We're going to get into that today.
And a time for sane heads to prevail. Morning, Sean.
Morning, Bern.
Sean, occasionally something significant happens and something appears significant to have happened in Europe. I remember the Cold War when there was an acceleration of nuclear capability and it looked dangerous. The President of Poland has now offered the West to cite a nuclear capability, presumably pointed the other way in his country.
Yeah, it's we're both old enough and ugly enough to remember the Cold War, and nuclear weapons felt like they were part and parcel of it. And there's thousands of them now pointed at from Russia to US and UK and vice versa. What's fascinating this last couple of weeks, though, Andrzej Duda, who's the president of Poland, has said he's offered to the West, if you want to forward locate nuclear weapons on Poland's soil, then I'm happy to do that. Why has he done that? Well, part of it is because Poland has always felt a bit vulnerable. If Europe's feeling vulnerable, Poland definitely does. It's had a bad experience from a couple of world wars. And by forward deploying, potentially strengthening the eastern flank of NATO, he's offered to do this. Well, of course, immediately the Russian deputy foreign minister stepped up and said, this is outrageous. If they're forward deployed, we will be targeting NATO weapons. We'll be targeting them in Poland. But the irony of this situation isn't lost on me, and I'm sure not on a lot of people. Who was the last country to make a big fanfare about forward deploying?
I wonder.
Yeah, Russia did this. They did it into Belarus. They made the announcement in the middle of last year. We heard last month that they've just finished that process. So the irony of actually making all this fuss, and it's back to this banging the drum of nuclear rhetoric. Now, from a military perspective, there's no advantage in forward deploying nuclear weapons. The problem with forward deploying,
because you can send them from a long way off.
You can send them intercontinental ballistic missiles, travel halfway around the world. They go into space. They're quite difficult to target when they're up in space because they're traveling so fast. And frankly, if you start moving them around, you highlight where they are, because with satellite technology today, you know exactly where they are. So, forward deploying them, it gives you your enemy a lot. They can hit them a lot quicker than they can if they're
and with very conventional weapons.
Correct. Yeah. So this is all about politics. This is all about the optics, and this plays to the whole point that what Putin's done very effectively up till now is, because he's a nuclear power, he's been saber rattling to the West, because Putin knows if the West not just provided weapons, was actually to intervene into the war in Ukraine, was to actually put boots on the ground, Western weapons and a Western no-fly zone, Russia will be stopped in its tracks. And it can't afford to let that happen. So it's been rattling this nuclear saber every time it has the opportunity. But that has worrying consequences downstream, I think.
Part of me thinks that his sort of big inevitable reaction to it is all sort of puff and wind anyway, because based on what you've said, there is no actual advantage to having this nuclear capability on Poland's soil, so so close to Russia. So what you know, why is he shouting about it? Why he just stay silent? Because it's of no, you know, everybody will know. I mean, you're a military analyst, you know. You know, I've just learnt something. Yeah, it sort of sounds common sense. Everybody knows what.
Yeah, so part of this goes back to the timing. So Russia made the announcement middle of last year. If you remember, that was when this much vaunted spring offensive was due to happen. And Russia was doing everything possible to stop the West putting more weapons in the hands of Ukrainians, because he was very worried that, and you know, Ukraine, that most of the West thought that they would make some sort of advance. And you remember right at the start of this war, Russia would have gambled that it knew if the West was to get involved, it could not have met its military objectives. So immediately that it started invading, it warned the West, don't get involved. When the West was talking about providing weapons, anti-tank weapons, right at the start, Russia went, provide weapons, you're risking in escalating the conflict. We did, it didn't. Then they talked about West was going to put tanks in. Oh, it might escalate. Lots of Western leaders prevaricating. Russia threatening nuclear Armageddon. We put tanks in. It didn't happen. Same happened for long-range missiles, and even now. Well, even now, the German Chancellor does not want to put long-range missiles into the hands of Ukrainians because it is worried, the Taurus missile, it's worried that it will risk to an escalation. And even the military briefings I have from colleagues and from senior military folk, they say the reason they don't want to intervene is they don't want to escalate into a major confrontation with Russia. And you go, okay, I get it. But now let's look at it from Putin's perspective. Most of the world does not have nuclear weapons. It's only very few countries that do. If he can go into Ukraine and the West won't intervene, where else could he go into? We did a podcast not that long ago talking about, you know, valuable minerals, didn't we? We talked about lithium for the battery industry. We talked about uranium for the power industry. And
sort of gradual control that Russia seems to be pursuing.
Exactly. So if Russia was to go into Africa, for example, and say, right, rather than just doing military support, we're going to take over parts of Africa. Last I saw, it wasn't a member of NATO, so that means that we do nothing.
So it's kind of indeterminate, really, where this might be going. I think most people who maybe don't understand the detail in the way you do would see it as an escalation. We know that Poland has been gradually increasing its percentage against its GDP, which has been growing anyway, so there's like an accelerating effect. I forget what it was last time we spoke, 3.5%. We know they're heading for 4%. You know, from the President of Poland's point of view, this is yet another opportunity to flex his muscles. He's in the headlines all of a sudden.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think for me, you're old enough to remember this. I'm not. Point
well,
made.
Thank you. We're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I knew.
Yeah,
I knew it.
No, but it was the last time that actually the world felt we were on the brink of world war, nuclear war. And of course there was DEFCON 5, DEFCON 4, DEFCON 3. We actually got to DEFCON 2 and the world was shaking. I mean, this was back in 28th of October, back in 62. But weapons, nuclear warheads being put into weapons. Aircraft were airborne on continuous patrol, ready to launch this stuff. That's what real threatening nuclear war feels like. We're nowhere near that today. Yet, because we have a generation that's never lived with that, Putin has been very effective at undermining the resolve of political leaders and saying, actually, we don't want to get involved because we don't want to risk a fight with Russia. But where does that leave us strategically around the world? Where does that leave China with regard to Taiwan? Where does it leave the West, given that resources, particularly minerals, fuel, stuff like that, are scarce? Whoever controls them will control the future. How do you stop a bully like Russia? Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute we want to get into a nuclear war.
You know what happened?
Go on.
With the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Phone call.
You'll know it from history books. I actually lived through it.
Yeah.
So I've got one on you, Sean.
Yeah.
Actually, it was solved by two savvy and possibly history might show reasonably mature individuals who decided to settle down. And there was a lot going on behind the scenes, but that seems to be what happened. Billy Joel's written a very good song about it, which is worth listening to.
I'm off to a Billy Joel concert and later on this year
in
Wales.
He will. I argue this is his favourite song of all time. Very, very emotional, because it's a real story about him, and it talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis and turning the ships around.
But I think rather than going down memory lane, I think the reason we're bringing this up is that the really interesting point today is that I'm very concerned that if we, as the West, have taken a political view that we are not prepared to confront Putin because of the risk of nuclear conflict, thinking that through, where that leads us into the future, I think is very worrying.
Okay, make a guess. Is the West going to say, yes, we take you up, we're going to get ready to put missiles in Poland, or not?
I don't think it's about Poland. I think what's more interesting is that we're seeing just a gradual ratcheting up, and President
rhetoric.
And President Macron is pushing even harder to say that we should get involved more militarily on the ground. And at the moment, he's on his own. The irony here, of course, is that they're not NATO. If they're part of NATO, we'd help them. It's only the other week that Israel was attacked by 331 missiles from Iran, and the West rushed in to shoot all these missiles down to protect Israel. Israel's not a member of NATO either. So we do it when it suits us, and we didn't think that was risking a nuclear confrontation because we weren't prepared to attack, but we were prepared to defend. Ukraine is defending.
Let's see. So, Sean, moving on from Poland and nuclear war, for the first time, I think I am worried for Ukraine. In the ebb and flow, who's got the advantage, who hasn't got the advantage, that seems to be, like a seesaw over the time this has been going on. Now, Russia seems to have made significant progress on the front line, taken or taking more towns and villages. It's not looking good.
No, it's not. I mean, wind the clock back a year and we were looking at the potential for a spring offensive. The West had piled weapons into Ukraine. All the talk was about where Ukraine would strike and how far, how successful it would be. Of course, we ended the year, front lines hadn't moved that much. Now, at the same time of year, it's the end of winter. The thaw has been, the grounds are firming up again. And that means that you can do maneuver warfare. A lot of the bigger machinery can move around the battlefield. But even then, over the last couple of weeks, the Russians have continued to push forward. Remember we talked about in February, Avdiivka falling, a huge battle for that. But it just felt that the Russians were still losing a lot of people to gain a little bit of ground. But if you look at the maps now, Avdiivka is actually some way behind the Russian lines. Russians have continued to move forward, still taking huge casualties. And Alexander Syrsky, who's the new chief of the military for Ukraine, has admitted the situation on the front line is very, very difficult at the moment. That's a political way of saying they're on the back foot. Russia is targeting cities, it's targeting energy infrastructure, it's targeting the front line with its missiles, and of course with rationing of artillery shells, bullets and the like. And with some areas of the front line, Russia overmatched Ukraine by 10-1. So, and there's just been announced Berdichi and a couple of other villages have recently fallen this week as well. But the point is, it may only be tactical progress, but momentum is incredibly important in warfare.
How does it actually work? So this is what I imagine. You target the areas you want to, on the front line, take. You basically bomb the hell out of them, which must be absolutely awful because you are creating devastation. You then send in, tanks and soldiers, and eventually, if you can, you take it. Opinion number one. Then, of course, you've got to back up your supply lines. You've got to have weapon dumps and, the tracks, the railway and the roads that you've blown up, the bridges you've destroyed, you now need to rely upon because you're stretching the distance from the motherland. And you've got to secure those if you want to retain the lines. That's quite a big thing you have to do to move forward a mile, let alone...
It is, and that's why they talk about the difference between a sort of just gradually shifting the front line, because you jump from your defensive trenches into your enemy's defensive trenches. So as long as your enemy, so in Ukraine's case, Ukraine will have had fallback defenses. As long as they've been properly, they literally up, move, settle down again. Russia have to consolidate this gain because, as you say, the logistics are all a lot more difficult. Generally speaking, in warfare, I don't want to sound like an army expert at all, but generally speaking, that's the time you do a counterattack, because your enemy are not well bedded in, they're not used to where everything is, and actually you can quickly go in and get them out again. That is sort of a gradual, sort of iterative process on the battlefield. If, however, you can gain momentum and push through, generally it's like a crust. The Ukraine's defenses are a thick crust, but if you can break through that, and now you do a breakthrough, now you can cause carnage, a bit like a dam. A little bit of the water starts flowing, and suddenly the floodgates open, and that would be called a strategic breakthrough, because that would cause the Ukrainians just to flee in chaos, and then you can make significant gains very quickly. At the moment, it's village to village to village, closing in on key towns.
So the Ukrainians will have bolstered up and defended their front line. And it's interesting, you know, we talk about trenches, you know, that's horrible. That's just like Second World War stuff still going on. One would imagine the stuff behind that, like villages, won't be that well defended, and therefore would be, you know, once you can get through, easy targets.
Yeah, but it is worth pointing out how, so Russia does a very attritional form of warfare. So the biggest casualties on the war are normally caused by artillery shells. So they land, they explode, they cause shrapnel damage. Whether they kill or wound, the issue is the same. In fact, in many ways, if you're wounded, you're more of a burden because you have to get that person back. So when these artillery shells explode, the shrapnel goes out sideways. So if you have a trench and you're below the level of the ground, unless the artillery shell lands in your trench, you'll generally be all right. And that's why you have trenches there. If you go into a village, you can hide behind walls, and because there's lots of stuff out there. What you don't want to be doing is, as a military, is get caught in open ground, because you can't hide. You can lie on the ground, but you're still vulnerable. So villages have in their own, you know, there's lots of walls and things like that for people to hide behind, and that's when tanks get in because they start blowing stuff up and it all becomes a bit more dynamic. But in effect, Russia on the offense will be losing a lot of people in this battle. It's clear they don't care, because the strategic objective at the moment still appears to be Putin wants to seize the whole of the Donbass. Remember that special military operation? He never
all this area he's taking now is in the Donbass.
In the Donbass. So he has a large swathe of it. He hasn't yet, there's a fillet of it he hasn't yet got. This all seems to be coherent with him trying to seize the whole of the Donbass. And from a grand strategic perspective, it looks likely that he will push as hard as he can. Intelligence suggests that the Russians are massing for a major offensive this summer. That's a real worry for Ukraine if they don't get the weapons through. And the question is, how far do they go? And I suspect the answer to that is they're looking at the American election. If there's a change of administration, potentially there's a deal to be done. If Putin can take the whole of the Donbass, and he's got the land bridge down to Crimea as well,
that might be deal done.
Well, for now, because Russia's probably spent its military force and would want to return, because it's paying something like 40% of its spending nationally is now on defence. That's not sustainable. So it may well be that the near-term ambitions are to call a halt at the end of this fighting season, be prepared to negotiate, however uncomfortable that might be, and potentially negotiate to get the sanctions lifted and stuff like that. How desperate would the West be to see a peace deal done? But on the front line, and for Ukraine, all this talk about winning, we talked a little bit about this last week. If you look at the realities on the battlefield at the moment, it's looking very difficult for Ukraine in the near term. Very difficult.
Well, last week we discussed that it might take time for the $60 billion from America to arrive actually in Ukraine. in terms of useful weapons and so on. So that's, we suggested, beyond the summer offensive from Russia. So that's not necessarily going to help here. Also, we discussed that it depends what the West wants. Now, let's assume they want Ukraine to be safe for lots of humanitarian and national independent reasons, but also the West has got other objectives also. How those accumulate to cause them to decide in a significant election year what they're going to do is maybe quite complicated.
It is. I'm just interested to see that if most of the conversations I've been having with senior military folks haven't really thought there was much chance of Russia doing a major breakthrough. But if you look at the situation on the ground at the moment, I'm not saying it's likely, but it must be a possibility. What would the West do if Russia does break through, and rather than just looking at the Donbass, starts to now run riots into Ukraine itself? Would the West step in to do something about it, which is an escalation? At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any political appetite to do that. And if they didn't step in, where would that leave Putin? Where would that leave him? Would he feel emboldened that actually he can walk into anywhere he likes as long as it's not a member of NATO, and he knows now how to do it? And likewise, China would look at it and go, I can go into Taiwan. And what other nations would be emboldened by that outcome?
Yeah.
Now, I think that's why President Macron of France is upping the ante a bit by talking up the prospects of potentially getting involved, because he's looking to the future and going, okay, if there is a ceasefire and a pause in the fighting and negotiation, nobody's going to be happy with that, but at least the war stops. But if that doesn't happen, if Russia does capitalize, if Russia does get on the front foot and potentially run away with this, is that an outcome that undermines European security? And the weapons bit, I think, is fascinating, because the artillery shells is just one example. Getting Patriot missile systems, yes, they're big, but they don't need many of them, because the Russians don't have many of the sort of missiles that Patriot is designed to intercept. But artillery shells, Ukraine needs about 1.5 million shells a year. That's 4,000 shells a day. Each of those shells is about 45 kilograms. That's 180 tons of artillery shells every single day.
And what's the issue there? Is it the transportation or storage or
It's D. All of the above. It's getting them, if they are in America, if they are in Poland, if they are in Germany, how do you get that quantity forward without it being obvious that you're doing that? And there's already reports, because Russia's got satellites, it's got intelligence on the ground. It's apparently now targeting railway lines and the like.
Yeah.
So it's a big issue to solve at this late stage with Ukraine already on the back foot.
Things just don't move that fast. It's now May, and it's going to be summer soon.
Exactly. We're going to be talking about this, I suspect, for some time. But the big question is, in a political election year for both US and the UK, I suspect, a bit like Israel, there may be a political appetite for a short-term solution rather than a long-term solution. And that might leave a legacy which history might judge unkindly.
So if I compare this to a game of chess, what Putin has done, he's moved his pawns to take more territory on the board. What we don't want him to do is take one of his knights, much more powerful, and just put it into a different, very threatening position.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy, isn't it? I think one of the things when you're a military planner, whether you're the superior military or the junior, what you're looking for is the centre of gravity. It's all about centres of gravity. If I was fighting you, what is the one thing that you don't want to lose? And it might be just say you don't want to lose the battle. But actually, for example, in the Russian case, probably doesn't want to lose Crimea. And if actually Crimea was threatened, would that incentivize Putin to come to a deal? Would he be happy taking the Donbass but losing Crimea? Almost certainly not. And therefore, when you're the underdog, you're trying to look at what it is that your enemy doesn't want to lose. I think Russia is actually, as you're saying, is just literally moving the pawns across the table, taking as much as he can, and then eventually will cement those lines, because by claiming that some of the occupied territories are now Russian, he potentially therefore now can dominate the people. He's going to get them to serve, Ukrainians to serve in the Russian army against Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing he's doing at the moment. So yeah, there's a bit of a worrying trend there.
Sean, turning to drones, we've discussed their new weapons, new technology. They're cheap to build. As we can see here, there's a great film of China and its display of their capability. It is a thing of absolute beauty, what they've done. The question is, it's beauty on one side, it's the beast on the other, as this new technology has emerged as quite a significant factor in the conflict that's going on around the world.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, because is it really a game changer? Is it something now that's revolutionized the whole concept of war? These drones look beautiful. We've had them in London for the New Year's celebration and the like. But the harsh reality is that if you put a hand grenade under each of them, flew 1,000, 10,000 into Wembley Stadium, you'd cause carnage. And that's the worry with these things. And because they're used so widely on the battlefields now, and we're seeing this sort of new innovation tackling legacy platforms. We're seeing it in the Red Sea. We're seeing drones, £20,000 a pop, they're high-end drones, being targeted by $1 million missiles. Now you go, okay, so we can schwack them out of the sky. Yeah, but how many £1 million missiles can you afford to have? Somebody who's building $20,000 drones, or $1,000 drones, or $50 drones, will always be able to produce more drones, and you possibly have missiles to take them down.
Yeah.
And I think that's the challenge, that defence, my time in defence, was dominated by some of the big companies, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, the like, who don't get out of bed for less than a few million. They're very, very good at building expensive platforms, ships, tanks and aeroplanes that are phenomenally capable, phenomenally expensive.
And take a long, long time.
Yeah.
For lots of reasons. So I, as a business guy and a tech guy, I would categorize the drone industry as a startup. And as a startup, you've got no legacy. You've got no baggage. You haven't got $1 million cost going into a single weapon that you've somehow got to recalibrate or transform in some way. You can start afresh, and that's frightening, and it's high tech as well. You know, talk about 20k, 10k, £500, $500. How many of those can you produce that are synchronized in an attack? Actually, that's frightening.
It's very frightening. And I was seeing on my feed the other day, and there's a company called Temu who does some selling of virtually anything online, and they were offering free drones. Now, I'm always a bit of a cynic with stuff is free, but the very fact these things have got an HD camera, can operate very independently, you go, if that technology is free, it's not going to be difficult with AI to be able to coordinate these things, particularly around fixed sites, whether it's air traffic control towers, whether it's aircraft at Heathrow.
Anything.
You've got one of those drones with a hand grenade that lands on each of the aircraft at Heathrow, puts them all out of action. One hand grenade. Now, those drones probably at the moment can't destroy a tank, because frankly, they've got a hand grenade size charge and it will just bounce off the top. Yes, you could develop a charge that will go through tanks. We used to operate them in my days flying Harriers, shaped charge plasma jets going through a tank, but they're very specialist rounds. You'd probably have to spend a lot of money to develop those, and therefore the unit cost will be huge. But the fact is, tanks, ships and aircraft are probably not your primary target.
No, well, I think for the reasons you've just said and the implications behind that, which I think are huge, I think we should see it as a game changer for two reasons. One is you can take out all sorts of targets. You can shut the energy system down in the UK. You imagine targeting wind farms with drones. You've only got to take out a blade. That particular device is out of action for probably a year plus. You take out 50 of them, you've shut down a whole wind farm. So that's, and you can multiply that by all the other strategic assets that you can take out. So that's on one side. The other side is, what about the defence industry that you've just described? Very conventional, very adult, very old-fashioned. Don't get out of bed for less than $1 million a pop. How do they respond to something this transformational, which can be manufactured cheaply by literally anybody?
And that's where I'm not entirely convinced. When we talked about last week, the 2.5%, more of our GDP being spent on defence, and the danger is, by just throwing money, will we just get more ships, tanks, and aeroplanes, or will we find a way that our defence industry in this country has been developed on the back of being very good at developing missiles, bombs, guided munitions? It's all high-end stuff. Where an air-to-air missile can cost $1 million a time, but it's very good. How does that industry, does it have the DNA to be able to react to a Ukrainian 18-year-old on the battlefield who watches his drone get shot down, reprograms it overnight, so changes it from a GPS drone to a terrain matching drone so that it can get through the next day? And it feels like that DNA of innovation, of agility, of technology, of ideas,
the winner.
It feels like that's the antithesis of what our current defence industry is about. And I'm fiercely proud of our defence industry in this country. I've flown its products. I'm well aware that for a major conflict, it's brilliant. But we are seeing this explosion in the use of drones and the ability now to be in the hands of everybody. Everybody's going to have one. They've been terrorizing airfields because privateers have been flying them in the way of big jets. But if you actually would do it properly, like you say, like that clip, coordinated quantity has a massive quality all of its own. And it's a worrying time in the defence sphere.
Yeah, just building on that, some time ago, one of the mainstream media in the UK was having a pop at one of the defence contractors, won't say who it was, and they basically dismantled the cost structure of the product, and they found that a screw cost £20. You multiply that, that's a lot of money. That same screw in a drone is a penny.
But I worked, one of the procurement areas I worked in, again, remain nameless, but the conversation with one of the big defence contractors was going, we are going to make X% profit, otherwise we won't do this. We can take that profit wherever you'd like it to go, but that's how much profit we need to take. And if you spread it across everything, your screw costs £20 a time.
And unemployment.
But if you want it to be zero, we can make that screw zero, but you'll pay a bit more for something over here.
Yeah.
But if the unit cost of that drone is £20, that manufacturer can't make £20 a profit. And that's why when you're producing, we talked about Storm Shadow missiles, didn't we, from the UK, 1,000 missiles, I think each of them cost £2 million a time. And that was because the development cost, the setting up the production facility and then producing them, plus the profit margin, meant that each of those 1,000 cost £2 million a time. If your production line is going to be producing 1 million drones a year, which is what Zelensky is trying to do, suddenly your setup costs are dwarfed. They are tiny when smeared over that many drones. If you're now looking at some of the market for drones globally, that's why they're coming down so cheap. And when the sensors, the lasers, the little synthetic capture radars, the computer systems are so light based on satellite technology, they're also cheap. That means that there is a real innovation frontier around the drone world.
And it's been broken every day. And in my world, software technology, my sort of premise is always, basically you can do exactly what you like. There is no end to the capability. Sean, have a look at this interview of Defense Secretary Austin in the US.
That's still being worked out, but there will be NGOs that will help to distribute that aid.
That Hamas is in charge of Gaza. When aid goes to Gaza, Hamas doesn't divert it or commandeer it or steal it. It accepts it. And anybody operating in Gaza is under the thumb of Hamas. The administration has discouraged Ukraine from launching refinery strikes against Russia. Why is the Biden administration discouraging Ukraine from undertaking some of the most effective attacks on Russia's war-making capabilities?
certainly those attacks could have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation, but quite frankly, I think Ukraine is better served in going after tactical and operational targets that can directly influence the current fight.
So it sounds to me like the Biden administration doesn't want gas prices to go up in an election year based on all the other actions they've taken to drive up gas prices further. But anyway.
So DevSec Austin is obviously uncomfortable with this interview. And he was asked a question about the $60 billion aid. And one of the conditions was, we don't want you to use the ATACMS missile capability against Russia. Now, it seems to me that anything that would give Ukraine the tactical advantage of this particular product, which you'll tell us, why that's the case, would be a good thing if the West want to protect Ukraine. But that wasn't the answer that Ukraine was given.
No, I think, Austin is a very, very well-respected individual, and he was evidently uncomfortable at that interview. I think before we get into the meat of it, what it did expose that this 60 billion has been a long time coming. There are a lot of politics playing out in the US around this. This isn't simply about getting aid to Ukraine. This is about priorities. This is about why should we be spending all that money overseas? Why shouldn't we be spending it at home? You heard Anthony Blinken the other day refer to the aid package as being jobs for the US. First time I've ever heard him say that, but he was making a point that if they're sending US weapons to Ukraine, then they're being paid for with US money, but that is creating jobs in the US. So there is benefit. I think this particular interview was around the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System. It's a long-range missile system. For the first year or so, I think it's 2 years of the war.
Long range being?
About 190 miles. So it can fire a long way behind enemy lines. But for a couple of years, America wouldn't provide long-range missiles to Ukraine for fear that they would use them to go beyond Russia's border with Ukraine and actually start attacking inside Russia itself. And it's one of those odd nuances of where we find ourselves at the moment, that Ukraine can do whatever it likes, but it can't use Western weapons to risk provoking anger by Putin. And the slight irony there is you're asking Ukraine to fight with at least one of its hands tied behind its back. So part of what Austin was trying to say was, yes, they're long range, but they can't strike inside Russia. But what Ukraine has been very effective at doing of late is targeting Russia's energy supplies, its oil and gas industry, refining industry. Why has it been doing that? Well, a couple of reasons, really. One of which is that Russia is needing to fund the massive war effort. It consumes huge quantities of resource, but through its oil revenues, it's able to fund its defense industrial base and buy weapons from North Korea and Iran. If you target that, you suddenly reduce the availability of those revenues, and that has a direct impact on Russia's war effort. The second reason they're attacking it is because if you fly a drone into Belgorod or make it fight against a tank or a ship, it's actually quite difficult to do any lasting damage. A little drone with a hand grenade on it on the side of a huge oil or gas refinery can do catastrophic damage.
You don't need to take out much.
No.
To take it offline for a couple of years.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And therefore...
and do a lot of, other damage, spillage, a lot of other stuff goes on.
So why is it America's not happy with them?
Well, if we come on to the American sort of motives in a minute, because the DevSec was searching for an answer, and he plucked this one out of the air. But before we get into that, it seems to me the front that Russia's now establishing is a long way from the Russian border. I don't know exactly how far it is, but it's quite a long way.
Yeah, Avdiivka is about 40 or 50 miles.
Okay. So if you've got this missile capability, you can stand way back and you can now start attacking the supply lines, which we've discussed earlier, which is in Ukraine's territory. So actually, as a missile capability, this is pretty useful tactically.
Tactically, it's incredibly useful. I mean, we need to caveat that slightly. If you can fire something 190 miles away, how do you know what you're firing at? So you need to have some pretty good intelligence. Part of that is satellite imagery or drone imagery or whatever. Now, at the moment, I wouldn't want to speculate, but Ukraine isn't a first world country when it comes to satellite technology. So you'd be asking yourself, where's Ukraine going to get that intelligence from?
It's done some good drone work though, hasn't it?
It's done some very good drone work, but most drones won't go 190 miles. You know, that most of the drones are relatively short range, and the ones that are longer range tend to be what they call suicide drones. They're going to attack stuff. So what you actually need is intelligence, because most of the targets that Ukraine want to take out are troops or logistics supply lines or vast quantities of ammunition.
In Ukraine, though.
No, I agree, but they've still got to identify. They've got to identify the target. Then they've got to track it. Then they've got to fire a very expensive missile to take it out. So it's not yes, you have to have the missile, but the missile is a small part of the overall capability. Whereas
you need to,
bullets and artillery rounds, you're just going to keep firing across the way. But the whole point of ATACMS was that it allows Ukraine to reach any part of Russia inside occupied Ukraine.
I mean, as a completely naive person from a military point of view, to call out a particular weapon and say you're not allowed to use this, it's like it raises it as an issue. Maybe unnecessarily, but nonetheless, it came out.
But probably for political reasons. These things never happen without a reason. I think part of that was a clear message to Putin. This is not. We are firmly protecting Ukraine. This is all about defense of Ukraine, and we are not letting them use it to attack, so that Putin can't
use it as a justification. Okay. Yeah, I suppose that's fair enough. Let's go on to the other side of it then. Devastator Austin is uncomfortable. He's searching. He's got a number of motives for making this a conditional, a gift on the 60 billion. The one he chose, slight surprise with, it's going to affect global oil prices.
So we've had a few bits of intelligence drip feeding.
Gas prices.
Yeah, oil and gas, energy prices. So we've had a few bits of intelligence drip feeding out over the last few weeks where Ukraine has been very effective at targeting some of Russia's oil facilities. There's been a public good effort, private. It's unhelpful to have the energy prices, because the natural effect of Russia having a smaller supply to be able to put into the global market, the price of oil is dependent on supply and demand. If you reduce supply, and demand stays the same, prices go up. And that, at the moment, in this country and in the US, has caused a lot of difficulty domestically. So it hurts us. And of course, when you're talking about a year where there is going to be an election,
right,
suddenly those sorts of messages suddenly become important. So at the moment, again, we haven't got a direct poll, but the recent polls that we've done in America show that a majority of Americans are questioning whether America should still be supporting Ukraine. If they're also seeing higher energy prices, we give a gift of weapons to Ukraine, then they go and blow up Russian oil and we end up with more expensive oil. You can see how that logic starts to undermine the case for American support for Ukraine.
Yeah, and the re-election of President Joe Biden.
Yeah. So there is a bit of politics around this. Unfortunately, if you get distracted by the symptoms, you lose sight of what the ultimate aim is here, and that's to stop Russia in its tracks. We might not like the impact that has, but I think there's a whole load of politics going on, which is why we talked about, American arms industries benefiting from this. Yes, they are always benefit in wars. And the long-term play here, which I think we're going to touch on another time, is that Russia used to export a lot of weapons around the world. Most people who are customers of Russian weapons will have seen how ineffective so many of them have been.
That's the end of that.
They'll be looking to the West for weapons in the future. Even if they are more expensive, there's no point in having a cheap weapon that doesn't work. And therefore, the potential market for the big global defence industries is huge, and therefore it would be wrong to ignore that. And I'm sure we're going to get into that in another podcast.